This is going to be 3 videos, and before I begin, there aren't many photos of the Belgica Expedition, and I've not managed to find a documentary or film made about it. So eventually I'm going to use AI images for the first time in one of these videos. Usually I prefer to use that tech for its proper purpose, creating bizarre mashups of different things in Tron, but needs must. But I will clearly mark where I used AI images so you can complain about it in the comments if you want. Also, the cast of characters in this are from a plethora of European countries and Greenland in the USA. I've never even heard some of these names spoken aloud before. So unless you're called Amundsen or Cook, I am going to mess up the pronunciation. The Arctic has bears. Antarctica has no bears. That's the easiest, non-geographical way to tell them apart. The word Arctic derives from the Greek word Arctos, which means bear, because it's located under the Ursa constellations. So Arctic is bare and has bears, while Antarctic is Antarctic, which means opposite the bears, or no bears. By all accounts, Antarctica should have been called something else entirely. You see, for centuries there'd been rumours and assumptions that out in the unexplored sea there was a great southern continent, Terra Australis. Of course, when Australia was discovered, it borrowed the name that had been used for hypothetical Antarctica for centuries. So Antarctica ends up being called Antarctica, opposite the Bear Land, or No Bear Land. And it has no bears, and it's all just a very weird coincidence.
Holy shit.
Anyway, in these videos I'm going to talk about the Belgica Expedition of 1897, the first people to ever winter in Antarctica and survive. That's not to say they were the first to experience the cold of the Antarctic winter though. Antarctica is a big place, and unlucky ships had run aground there before. The crew of the Belgica were just the first to survive the experience. Possibly the first people to ever set foot in Antarctica were the crew of the San Telmo in 1819. The fact that I said possibly means that you know this isn't going to end well. The San Telmo was a Spanish warship sent as part of a convoy to help crush independence movements in South America. It was badly damaged en route, blew off course and towards the south, and was never seen again. However, decades later, some remains of the ship were found in the South Shetland Islands, some of the most distant parts of the Antarctic continent. So the chances are the first people to land in Antarctica died there before it was officially discovered in 1820. Oh, and this is a fun note, but as I script this, I've discovered that Wikipedia's article on the history of Antarctica says that the San Telmo's remains were discovered in February 1819. But the article on the San Telmo itself says it vanished in September 1819.
Time travel!
Anyway, the Belgica was Belgium's first attempt at Antarctic exploration. And although it was a nationalistic expedition, it's literally called the Belgica Expedition, much of the crew wasn't Belgian. Mainly because most of Belgium's exploration interest was aimed at the scumbaggery going on in the newly acquired Congo. Yes, the Belgian one. You might expect the expedition to be funded at least partially by the king, given his personal interest in colonialism, but he turned them down, possibly because of the lack of black people to kill, or possibly because he had a grudge against the expedition leader Adrian de Gerlache, who turned down a request to map the waterways of the Congo for him. Initial funding came from Belgium's rich. It was supplemented by private donations and a series of twee-Victorian things like bicycle races and hot air balloon rides, with the final closing funding coming from the government. De Gerlache came from one of Belgium's most venerable families, but it still took him 3 years to get the expedition off the ground. Belgium was a young country in 1897, less than 70 years old, smaller than most of its European neighbours, with only a short coastline. It threw itself into exploration because it was one of the few ways to get surefire respect in Victorian Europe. That and massacring people. It did that too. Anyway, with the Belgica, de Gerlache didn't just have his own career on the line, but his family's and his country's reputations. And this kind of explains some of his decisions down the line. So the expedition was planned for 2 years, with an overwintering in Australia between 2 summer visits. The plan was to explore the pack ice, chart unexplored parts, and eventually meet up with the area previously explored by Ross and Crozier on the Erebus and Terror 50 years earlier. That's just in case you were wondering how I was going to work the Franklin expedition into this whole thing. It's a testament to just how good Ross and Crozier were. The furthest south in 1897 was their record set in the early 1840s, and the Belgica didn't get anywhere close to breaking it. Now, most expeditions had extra, sexier aims on top of the more pedestrian stuff like charting colossal ice cliffs and risking certain death. So de Gerlache decided to try and find the southern magnetic pole, which Ross and Crozier had failed to find in their expedition. Don't feel too bad for them though. Ross had found the North Magnetic Pole about 10 years beforehand. So why were the polar explorers so interested in magnetism? Apart from the searches for the magnetic poles, Crozier had become a member of the Royal Geographical Society on the back of his magnetic work in Antarctica. It was just a giant part of polar exploration. So, what was it about? Well, there was the hope that magnetism could be used in navigation. That if you map natural magnetic fields, you could tell where you are. Basically, as Michael Palin put it, it was a 19th century attempt at GPS. Alas, the Belgica's magnetic research was being done by Danco. Not a bad guy, just a very unsuitable one. He was a soldier and an old friend of de Gerlach's who wasn't a scientist. But he tried his best. He came along as moral support for de Gerlach, and there was literally no other job available for him to do, so he gave it his best shot. Oh, and one of the things you're going to notice about this crew is just how many of them look like a spiffingly Victorian-themed drag king trap, and I'm here for it. And for knowledge, so on to the rest of the crew. They were a mix of European from Belgium, Romania, Poland, Norway, France, and one American. Dr. Frederick Cook, who you might remember from my Race to the Poles videos. Over the time they were together, the crew developed a mixed lingo from all the pieces of the language they spoke. A less dramatic version of this kind of thing happens today in international Antarctic bases as the inhabitants' accents shift slightly to more resemble each other, creating short-lived Antarctic accents, and allowing scientists to study how real-life accents appear organically. Anyway, the crew, there were about 20 of them, the number fluctuated over the course of the expedition. The captain was Georges Leconte, a Belgian artillery officer with experience of high explosives. They brought half a ton of something called tonite with them to blast the ice if they got stuck. They believed it was better than dynamite. The fact that it's a footnote in history indicates that they were wrong about that. I won't tell you about everyone in the crew, but among the characters were Chief Mechanic de Vouvier, who was fired in Brazil after going on a 2-day bender and then rehired in Uruguay when they couldn't find a suitable replacement. He was eventually fired for good in Chile after getting drunk, insulting a local dignitary, brandishing a pistol, and starting a minor mutiny.
Jesus.
The ship's cook was a temperamental Frenchman called Lemonnier, who was so unpopular with the rest of the crew that during a night of heavy drinking, some of them decided to attack him. They then all blamed him for the whole thing and got him fired and left in South America. Then Lemonnier's replacement took part in de Vouvier's mutiny was fired. So the eventual cook was Michaud, de Gerlach's assistant who couldn't cook. There was Dabrowski, one of the scientists, a Polish separatist, who spent several years in a Tsarist gulag and only recently escaped, run off to Belgium and, I assume, taken the chance to get as far away from Russia as possible. He later invented the concept of the cryosphere, which you can Google, and eventually became one of the important figures of Polish geographical sciences. And of course, there were two celebrities, Roald Amundsen, 24, who had applied for a job as a common sailor, but was given the job of first or second mate. People seriously argue about which it was. Though young, he was already dedicated to becoming a great polar explorer. For instance, as a child, he'd sleep with the windows open, in winter, in Norway. And lastly, there was Dr. Frederick Cook, arch-enemy of Robert Peary, possibly the first man to the North Pole. Now, when I say that, am I talking about Cook or Peary? The answer? Yes, but you can hear all about that in my Race to the Poles videos. Cook was Amundsen's polar Yoda and a bit of an eccentric genius. When accompanying Peary on an earlier expedition, he'd spent time with the local Inuit, learning the language and stuff that had aided him in Antarctica. Stuff that he'd pass on to Amundsen and get him to the South Pole. Stuff like how to make igloos, how to make clothing out of furs and skins, the best ways to use dogs. In the Arctic, he also learned how to scale ice walls with an axe, shoot, and ski. Those last two he didn't need to pass on to Amundsen, though. The dude was a 19th century Viking. Cook fell out with Peary after their expedition. He wanted to publish a book on his Arctic adventure, concentrating on the Inuit. It would have been anthropology, if it really existed at that point. But Peary wouldn't allow it. At that time, the usual thing was for the expedition leader to have complete control of publications. And Peary couldn't countenance sharing anything with Cook. Anything. So Cook decided to head south, all the better to get away from Peary. But first, he needed to prepare, so he headed north again and brought supplies back with him. Along with a couple of Inuit teens, Kalakatak and Miktak, that he borrowed from their parents. Basically, they became his wards as he tried to raise funds for further expeditions. Taking part in his talks, giving demonstrations, helping to draw the crowds. Now, if this was most polar explorers, this would have a very dark ending to go with how dodgy this sounds, but Cook is one of the less evil polar explorers I've read about. The guy had a very complicated attitude to the truth, as in he lied a lot, but he wasn't actively evil. The two lived in his mother's garden. Apparently they preferred that over the house. He helped them build an igloo for the winter. They hated ice cream. And good to his word, he took them home. Along with some Inuit who'd been stranded in New York for years, since they'd been brought south to the last World's Fair and been abandoned. Now, Cook had a very different aim for his planned Antarctic expedition than de Gerlach. He wanted to go for the actual South Pole, the bottom of the world, not the magnetic pole. He wanted to use dogs and travel fast, just like Amundsen would do years later. But for all his stunts, Cook was never able to raise the funds needed for his own expedition, and so he applied to join the Belgica, joining them in Brazil. Good thing he did. Cook is one of the few people on board who knew exactly how bad it gets overwintering the polar ice. I could do a whole video on Cook's efforts to get funding for his expedition. How he met Andrew Carnegie, who thought the only benefit to mapping Antarctica would be to mine it for ice. How he publicised a Norwegian who claimed to have found evidence of a lost civilization under the ice, possibly inspiring H.P. Lovecraft. How he sold tickets for a trip to the Arctic to raise funds, but it cost him more than he made because the ship sank. This was the trip that took the Inuit home, by the way. Anyway, back to the expedition. The Belgica itself was a whaler called the Patricia that had been bought from a Norwegian whaling fleet. They had to delay the expedition for a year or risk arriving in winter, so they took the time to radically overhaul the ship. Reinforced hull, extra insulation, labs, expanded poop deck, retractable propeller, new engine, photography darkroom. The ship's first discovery was almost its last, a reef off the coast of Terra del Fuego. They almost sank. On the way to the Antarctic, there were so many seabirds following them that they would fish for birds. They put some meat in a hook attached to a line and threw it into the air. The expedition had 2 cats, one of whom was thrown overboard by Captain LeConte while he was seasick and he saw it shitting on his deck. It wasn't rescued. Winky was the youngest member of the crew, promoted from cabin boy to sailor when the 4 who took part in the minor mutiny were removed. Eager to prove himself, he volunteered enthusiastically for the most dangerous jobs and was the first to die. Sent overboard into the freezing waters while trying to do some repairs on the outside of the ship. They tried to fish him out of the water but weren't successful. When he found out what happened, Captain LeConte disobeyed orders and leapt in after him, in full uniform, but it was too late. He was already beginning to freeze. The next day, they sighted Antarctica. There was a delay between the accident and LeConte finding out about it because there was a very real language difficulty among the crew. Sometimes, even the simplest things had to be translated and retranslated, resulting in a very lengthy game of telephone. This is one of the reasons the shared lingo the Belgica developed. The language issues were so bad that it's possible that de Gerlach didn't actually know what was going on when he tried to stop LeConte from leaping overboard into the freezing ocean. Anyway, I'll leave you there in sight of Antarctica proper. 1 man down. Join me next time to find out what happened to the most isolated men on Earth.